Young Mexican men divided, a possibility for transforming masculinity. Is the transformation of masculinity in young men in Mexico possible? To answer this question, I will present data on the current social and economic situation in Mexico that will allow a contextualization of men. I will also examine the beliefs about gender relations that young men hold and conclude by suggesting some possible interventions. The social and economic context. In 2005, Mexico had a population of over 103 million inhabitants within its national territory. In addition, over 11 million Mexicans were then living in the United States. This is of great economic importance since the remittances sent by Mexican migrants in the United States are the second largest source of foreign exchange for Mexico, preceded by oil export revenues. Despite being one of the 14 most important economies on the planet, Mexico has one of the highest indices of inequality in the world, as close to 50% of the population lives under condition of poverty, whereas 76% of the population lives in urban areas. A large dispersal of inhabitants live in small rural conditions. Since the 1970s, Mexico has experienced a drastic drop in its fertility rate resulting from a birth control policy focused on women. In Mexico, homophobic discrimination has become an increasingly visible phenomenon. 48% of the Mexican population will not allow a homosexual person to live in their home, and the number of homophobic homicides is extremely high. Over 10 million Mexicans are indigenous people who speak native languages, which can be classified into 68 different linguistic groups. 7.4 million young people aged between 12 and 28 neither study nor work, women being the most affected sector. Insecurity and violence related to kidnapping, drug, human and arms trafficking show a tendency to worsen. Justice administration institutions are riddled with disrepute, impunity, and corruption. Citizens feel they can no longer trust political leaders and myriad public institutions. Civil society shows both advances and regression in social mobilizations, along with a tendency to be increasingly active and organized in various areas. Security, taking ownership of both public spaces and human and political rights, as well as the fight against gender violence. In this adverse context, Mexican women have shown remarkable social participation. They have increasingly joined the labor market in both the service and industrial sectors. 1 of every 4 households in Mexico is managed by a woman. Increasing proportion of women are conscious of and exercise their sexual and reproductive rights. The number of women enrolled in all education levels has increased. The number of government institutions that promote women's economic, political, social and cultural participations are growing at all levels. Law stipulating that all levels of government must promote gender equity and confront gender-based violence are being passed. Conservative sectors, of course, offer significant resistance to these changes. This characterization of contemporary Mexican society sets the stage for any reflection on the situation of the men who face the specific conditions of this current social and economic context with its incumbent employment problems. Due to either loss of employment or the increasing precariousness of work and economic uncertainty, the social mandate of men as breadwinners and the figure of family authority is now being questioned. Migration very often splits and distances the family, dilutes the relationships within the family, and weakens the paternal bond. It also impacts on sexuality and exposes both the men who migrate and their partner once the men come back to sexual and reproductive health risks. The struggle for subsistence in the informal Mexican economy excludes men and their relatives from Social Security health care. Only very recently has the multi-ethnic and multicultural nature of Mexican society been recognized. The indigenous population has been discriminated against in terms of its racial and ethnic conditions, as well as gender, sexual orientation, and poverty. This configuration creates a phenomenon of multiple vulnerabilities that impact on men in a differentiated way. Most young men people in Mexico face a hopeless socioeconomic horizon and see their potential for socioeconomic transformation dissipating, thus placing them under condition of vulnerability. Young men, particularly those experiencing institutional exclusions from schools and work centers, are fittingly easy targets for recruitment by organized criminal gangs. Young men become a disposable population used for a variety of criminal activities at low cost. On the other hand, women are increasingly demanding men modify their interpersonal relationships. At a social level, compliance with the legal framework that ensures forms of relationships that tend towards equality is also being demanded. The social, economic, political, and cultural tension Mexico is experiencing that have been outlined so far are a preamble to show some of the impacts that shows tension are having on men in Mexico. The following questions are therefore come out. Is there an inclination to change gender relations among men? How can their inclination to move towards transformation be identified? Are there any technical tools that allow their inclination to change to be measured, quantified? Is the inclination to change correlated to a congruent and clear practice? Some clues to answer these questions are offered below. Are young men in Mexico egalitarian, dominating, or indecisive? Far from being a gradual and linear process of change, the transformation of main conceptions, expectations, and practices of masculinity is a process waged in the territory of power, which is in constant flux, both in its intensity and in its dynamics, and as such it responds to the specific of each context. The advances, stagnation, and regression observed are due to myriad factors that intervene, as well as to the back and forth pressures for and against the structure that sustain masculine domination as opposed to those that promote equal relations. The changes based on dialoguing, respect, and the construction of autonomy are undoubtedly the most promising. Beliefs are an opportunity to value the level of rigidity, flexibility of gender relations, and the view toward change that men may assume regarding masculinity. A belief is an acquired inclination that triggers a coherent set of response determined by an object or an objective situation that has been understood. A belief is constructed by the following elements: experience, motivation, and justification. In Mexico, the 2005 National Youth Survey includes a section of beliefs about gender relations. These beliefs are a lens through which it is possible to see the inclination of youth towards housekeeping tasks, employment, responsibility for family sustenance, and the rational, emotional underpinning of these actions. The data presented here refers only to men. This survey has different levels of representations for purpose of comparison, nationwide information, and the information from the metropolitan area of Guadalajara has been chosen. This slide presents the belief statements in the survey to which the individuals respond by stating their level of agreement. Answering agree to statements A and B and disagree to the rest of the statements C to H can be interpreted as showing their inclination to change gender relations from their particular concept of masculinity that ranges from flexibility to rigidity. The position young men hold probably underlies their everyday relationships in peer groups, family relations, school and workplace, recreational and sport places, which are of the greatest significance for young men in Mexico. The first aspect to be emphasized is that flexibility regarding agreement with beliefs is not uniform in various senses. In this chart, you can identify the statement and the region, the first column, and the level of agreement: agree, agree in part, and disagree. Number 1. There is diversity among young men. In green, there are flexible men who favor change. In orange, resistant men who hold a conservative position. In yellow, and indecisive men who agree in part and whose position awaits the unfolding of conditions generated by the relationships. There are regional variations. In green, the proportion of flexible position in all the belief statements is greater at a national level than in the metropolitan area of Guadalajara, which allowed for the presumption that there are other regions in Mexico with a larger proportion of young men who are flexible enough to adopt a position of change regarding masculinity. Some beliefs are more inclined to position of change than others. In green, beliefs related to housework tasks, statements B and D, concentrate the highest frequency of flexible positions. The statements that shows a lower inclination to change is the tension between child care and women's working outside the home. Statement E. The second aspect to note is the proportion of young men who show a position of resistance to change. In orange, those answering agree to statements C, D, E, F, and G, and disagree to statement A. The frequency of the answers to each statement is similar when comparing the metropolitan area of Guadalajara and the national level. It could be said that there is a conservative segment of young Mexican men who consider that there must be a division between public masculine spaces and private feminine spaces, where men enjoy and consider a property specific attributes: working, providing, being rational, but underestimate and disapprove of any incursion women may make in the public masculine space, particularly vis-a-vis the possibility of combining both worlds, child care and out-of-home employment. Statement E. In yellow, a third point shown by the survey is that between 2 and 4 out of every 10 young men feel reservation about the belief that they presented, agree in part. This situation can be interpreted in at least 3 different ways. One interpretation is that since they are young men who are indecisive and lack experience, they simply do not have a clear idea. The second is that they hold a critical and reflexive position. To agree in part implies that certain elements that will condition the assumption of a position are being pondered. Therefore, depending on the specific cases, these young men may or may not adhere to one position or another. They are not die-hard defenders or unremitting opponents, but rather the specificity of the situation has a defending weight. They are likely to be young people inclined to contribute arguments when the situation demands, who under changing conditions will be inclined to compromise. The third possible interpretation is that the largest proportion of young men with reservations, though taking agree in part, reside in the metropolitan area of Guadalajara, considered in Mexico as a typical conservative area. In this sense, it is compatible with a position of double standards whereby a political correct discourse is adopted, does not agree with a social practice tending toward equality. Helping transform masculinity among young men. As was observed in the earlier discussion regarding beliefs, there are 3 different sectors of young Mexican men with an inclination toward changing the relations between genders in a more or less differentiated way, which will imply changes in their view of masculinity. A significant proportion maintains beliefs that are compatible with egalitarian relationships. This does not necessarily imply that these beliefs inequivocally translate into actions in that direction, but it does imply that there is a considerable likelihood that it is currently occurring. In this sense, the winds are favorable, so to speak. It is a tendency that should be both taken advantage of and straightened. These young men may well have had to withstand criticism for showing an interest or inclination towards openness, dissent, diversity, and supporting equal relations with women. In the face of an adverse context that reproduced the dominant practice of masculinity and that questioned alternative ways of constructing masculinity, it is also likely that these young men choose to respond in various ways: by remaining silent in order to avoid problems, by insulating themselves and taking distance from their peer groups, and by allowing relations of domination to reproduce in their immediate environment in a spirit of disagreeing with them and in a spirit of having arguments that validate alternative ways of relating that are more beneficial. How it is possible to facilitate these young men presenting their motivations, experiences, and reasons for establishing equal relations with women, with their girlfriends, sisters, and female friends, neighbors, workmates, and schoolmates? Other young men can be drawn to these new forms of relationship that exist but are unnamed when they are granted social recognition. To positively value these young men, and by extension all those who have a relationship of equality, is to facilitate a change toward more satisfactory relationships that helps to estrange both individual autonomy and social solidarity. Young men have identified the needs for a space in which they can discuss gender relations in an atmosphere of respectful dialogue. This provides an opportunity to young men who feels an affinity with others who wants to come out into the open about their egalitarian ideas and value them in a positive way without being a target for homophobic criticism. In other instances, it is seen as an opportunity to confirm that the equal relationships that they have been forging are also valued positively and shared by other men like them. This offers a possibility to generate alternative alliances that are pleasurable and enriching as opposed to destructive and paralyzing alliances that reproduce masculine domination. Given the nature of the population of young men in Mexico, schools are ideal places to set up medium and long-term interventions. The development of this intervention must be well planned and moved forward step by step. This requires training teachers how to conduct this activity as part of the school curriculum. The development of curriculum that allows students to identify different aspects of gender relations. The development of a critical mind regarding the forms of domination in which men participate. The negative effects masculine domination produces of men themselves and those who surround them. Collective alternatives based on successful and pleasurable experiences of equal relation between men and women that are not based on power, but on equality, solidarity, and friendship. The use of resources that can draw young men, like film, forums, or the development of websites in the Internet, takes into account participatory and democratic processes that see to the specificities of young men, favor spaces that are heterosocial and are free of homophobic expressions, a network that can hold the space for and provide assistance to the young in various fields when requested. The establishment of solid criteria to follow out and evaluate the process in order to show the positive effects of intervention strategies with men. It must be kept in mind that at least 50% of the young population in Mexico enters high school. Approximately 35% move on to higher education. The majority of youth are not in the classroom. Reaching out to the population that does not study requires another strategy. Here, electronic mass media could play a key role. An alliance with media inclined to social analysis and to search for solutions, including university radio stations and television channels, some of which are widely recognized internationally for the quality of their programming, could prove to be extremely positive. Non-profit community radio stations like Radio Educación could also be included. An alliance between Radio Educación, Cómplices por la Equidad, Men Engage Mexican Chapter, and the Mexican Academy of Gender Study of Men that focuses on the meaning and inclination to change masculinity in young Mexican men, is an opportunity that has not yet been fully exploited.